Hypnotic Spectre, Hymn to Torok, Wasteland, and Daze. These cards are the iconic pieces of a particular type of strategy, one that was fairly common in the early days of Magic the Gathering, but as time has gone on, Wizards of the Coast has sidelined this idea more and more, to the point where nowadays this type of strategy might be considered forbidden. The type of strategy I'm talking about is one that we could call a strategy of constrained resources. So let's examine how constrained resource strategies work, why Wizards of the Coast may have moved away from them, and also what we can learn as game designers about where we could use this type of gameplay to create a particular kind of experience for players.
Distraction makers.
When we take a look at any kind of game, we can analyze its resources. With Magic in particular, we have the most important resources in the game are life, your life total, the number of cards that you have, the number of lands that you have, and also time. Time is a little tricky, so we'll kind of leave this one out for now. But with each of these types of strategies, we can turn the knob either direction, where you can gain life or you can lose life. You can draw cards or you can discard cards. You can ramp or play extra lands, or you can destroy land. And Magic used to experiment a lot more with the sort of negative side of these resources. This would be losing life, discarding cards, or destroying lands. And we can see these play patterns in the formats that still utilize cards from that earlier period of time. So there's sort of two different styles of approach to this type of strategy. There's the style of tempo, which can be best illustrated with the deck Dimir Tempo in Legacy. And the iconic cards that are part of the strategy are the cards Wasteland and Daze, where with Wasteland, instead of you using your land drop for your turn to push yourself further up the mana curve so that you can play bigger, more powerful spells, you are instead using your land drop to destroy one of your opponent's lands, sort of keeping you both at this parity of constrained resources. And then Daze comes into this equation where it's counter-target spell unless its opponent pays 1. By constraining your opponent's lands, you are keeping Daze relevant for longer. We can think of tempo as a strategy that doesn't really care how many cards your opponent draws, but you do care about how many lands that they have to play them. You can have as many cards as you want, but you're not going to be able to resolve any of them. The other side of the coin is what's called attrition. And when we're looking at sort of these more eternal formats, we can look at the deck Mono Black Moneyball in pre-modern. And this is sort of your classic attrition style discard deck where you're playing Hypnotic Spectre and you are attempting to constrain your opponent's resource of cards. And we can think of this strategy as you can have as many lands as you want, but you're not going to have anything to cast with those lands. There's also kind of a third constrained resource strategy here, which is the one that attacks the life total. And this is just what we refer to as aggro. It's one of the more common archetypes, obviously, and one that Wizards of the Coast has kept around. With aggro, you are essentially constraining your opponent's life total, but also putting pressure on the resource of time. All of these decks need to put some kind of pressure on the resource of time, but in the case of aggro, that's your sort of sole focus. I don't care how many lands you have, I don't care how many cards you have, but you're not going to have enough time to cast them. Something that's important about these sort of constrained resource play patterns is that they are inherently orthogonal. We talked about the difference between parallel and orthogonal play in a previous video. The difference between parallel play and orthogonal play is that parallel play is focused on basically your own board. We also could associate this with an abundant resource type of game, right? Because if you're not going to be constraining your own resources in that instance, right? You could be, and there's been some interesting play patterns in the past that have explored that idea. The examples that I'm thinking of are Threshold and Madness. I might be a little biased because my first tournament deck was Blue-Green Madness. But this idea that you might want to constrain your own resources to get some other kind of benefit, I think is interesting, but it is really counterintuitive to new players. And I think that's what they discovered way back in Odyssey block with the development of Madness and Threshold. When we're talking about games of abundant resources, these games tend to be a bit more forgiving of players' decisions because if you have so many resources, you can make mistakes, and those mistakes can kind of be mitigated by the fact that you just have so many resources that you can play enough things that it doesn't necessarily matter as much. They also support big, splashy plays, playing creatures with big power and toughness. These numbers are all sort of relative to the set points of the game, so when your life total is 40, a 10-10 creature feels different than if your life total is 20. And finally, because you have abundant resources, you end up with a lot of game pieces on the board. You end up with a lot of resources to play, a lot of game pieces to connect synergistically between these pieces, and there's a lot of opportunity for cards to interact together while they're in play. When we look at the green-white landfall deck at the recent Pro Tour, this is basically what's happening there. That is a strategy of abundant resource. We can see that it can lead to a lot of board complexity. So some of the cons of abundant resource strategies, because the design is so much more forgiving of mistakes, it can feel like your decisions matter less. When that's the case, there's less incentive for you to think creatively or think outside of the normal way that you would play these cards. You tend to sort of follow a prescribed play pattern that is not very interruptible because you're not hitting the same sort of hiccups that you might hit if someone is directly interacting and you have constrained resources. We can come back to the idea of entropy versus nudge entropy here, where games don't inherently have systems of entropy built into them. They are they when they're not in motion, they're static instead of decaying. And so when a player puts the force of optimization on a game, they tend to optimize the fun out of it. And so you need to design systems, ways to decay players' optimal strategies so that they can continue to play the game longer. Because the systems are not in motion on their own. Games that have very consistent resource systems, something like Hearthstone, they tend to play out very much on curve, right? This is the idea that you are playing a 1-drop turn 1, 1-drop turn, or a 2-drop turn 2, 3-drop turn 3. Magic players experience this often, especially in 1v1 environments where if a player curves out and the other player doesn't, the player who didn't is at a distinct disadvantage. But a game of abundant resources, you're going to be able to curve out probably every time because your resources are not constrained. And because there's not an incentive to interact with your opponent resources directly, this can feel like gameplay can feel like two ships passing in the night. This is kind of something we talked about with parallel play, where if I am focused solely on my board and building up my own resources and not constraining your resources, I could just potentially ignore you until I'm ready to win the game. And some games might not even have this kind of conflict built into their systems, where it can just be a game of I am building up abundance of resources, and then I sort of win through victory points or, I don't know, crossing the finish line first effectively, and I don't have to interact with you at all. And the example I always bring up here is Lorcana's change to Magic's health system, where Lorcana is a count up kind of system. So your creatures can attack your opponent's creatures, or they can tap to gain lore, which is the resource that wins you the game. Once you go from 0 to 20, you win. And the sort of parallel play aspect of this is that in Lorcana, you don't have to actually attack your opponent to get to 20 lore. You can just essentially ignore them and just collect lore until you win. It does kind of force the issue when you're in a situation where one player is ahead in that race, but it forces that player to be the one that's interacting. Back to constrained resource play patterns. This type of gameplay can be very skill testing because any individual mistake can cost you the game because you're operating in a game of constrained resources. An individual decision might be able to break you out of that constrained resource game. And because of this, there's a lot of incentive for you to find unique ways to play your cards to get yourself out of this constrained resource kind of situation. And in gameplay-wise, I think that is a pretty powerful force that you can put onto the players. And it helps you get a lot of value out of the fact that you have an opponent to play against because you must interact, right? You must find a different way, a different curve for your strategy through your opponent's interaction. And there's some cons here, especially in Magic's system in particular, in that this type of constrained resource gameplay can create non-games, meaning that if a strategy of constrained resources is extremely successful, it can basically mean that your opponent doesn't even get to play the game because you have constrained their resources so much. There's no way for them to sort of break out of it and move into what might be the mid to late game or more abundant resources. And Magic in particular has almost no guardrails for this. You are not guaranteed the resource of land every turn. The system itself is putting pressure on that resource. Even in parallel play, you might have to play suboptimally because you don't have a land drop. And this really is one of the benefits to Magic's land system, honestly. Benefits and biggest drawbacks. It's that sort of double-edged sword here in that even if the game is highly parallel play, you still are sort of getting interference from the game system. One way to think about it is that if you were guaranteed a mana every turn, then this style of gameplay might be a little less punishing in Magic the Gathering, because you as the opponent attempting to constrain the resources are not, you would then be fighting against the system instead of the system kind of working in your favor. And so a game that has more consistent resources might be able to experiment more with this type of play pattern. There's a lot of players that do not find constrained resource gameplay particularly fun. So I think it's important that we kind of talk through what fun is briefly. I think this is worth its own video, but one way that I like to think about it is that fun exists on a spectrum. And I tend to use the word compelling because the idea of fun always being a positive experience, I think, hinders our ability to view what could be considered fun. And so I tend to use the word compelling, especially because there's sort of, just like with abundant resources and constrained resources, there is sort of two sides to this coin where there are sort of the positive aspects of fun and there are the negative aspects of fun. And using a term like fun, which I think puts a bit too much weight into the positive side of that experience, where the word compelling could be a good or a bad thing. Let's talk about what makes something compelling just briefly. We can look at it on a spectrum. On one end, we have, on one extreme, we have boredom, and on the other extreme, we have frustration. And somewhere in the middle of these two things is what we might consider compelling. When we look at this abundant resources versus constrained resources, we can place them at two different ends of the spectrum in that the fail state of abundant resources is one of boredom because there's basically no challenging. There's no challenges. And on the far end, a game of constrained resources fail state would end up in frustration because there's no way for you to play the game, right? You are stuck. You are constrained. I do think that both of these experiences are valid. I do think Magic System in particular tends to make a game of constrained resources especially frustrating because its systems also kind of lean in that direction. But there's no reason why a game would have to be in that space. You could change the way that players receive their mana resource, and that would alleviate some of that systemic pressure from constrained resources. But I think one of the most interesting examples I can give here in how I think both of these experiences are totally valid is when the pandemic was happening. I recognized that there was this connection between like the two sort of big games that exploded during that time were Animal Crossing and Elden Ring. And these games sit on basically complete opposite ends of the spectrum. And so it's pretty interesting to see, given such an extreme scenario that, people just were not prepared to deal with, and having sort of this cultural experience and see it play out in sort of these two different ways, the extremes of what appealed to people, something like Animal Crossing, which is much more, which is basically an entirely parallel sort of abundant resource management kind of game, and Elden Ring, which is an incredibly challenging, constrained resource kind of game that borders very closely on frustration, especially for a lot of players. And those two things became one of those two things, or both, became people's kind of desired experience at the time. So I think it's also important to think about how this spectrum of gameplay style, right? Going back to the fact that these resource knobs in any game we can turn either in the positive direction or in the negative direction. I think both of those existing in a game is important. You can design a system to lean one way or the other depending upon the experience that you want to give to your players. But the idea that either one of these is available creates extremely dynamic gameplay, and those play patterns feel incredibly distinct from one another. This is something that sort of has been an observation of mine with Commander Magic, is that its play patterns tending towards parallel and abundant resources tend to play out quite similarly. And after you've gone through enough reps of that style of play, you start to recognize that this play pattern is essentially the same through a lot of this stuff, or at least there's a handful of sort of abundant resource type strategies, and those we have a lot of cards that sort of coalesce around those things like aristocrats or ramp, or games that end in the sort of Craterhoof, Behemoth, whatever it is, these big spells that just sort of end the game. And I think that play pattern can get a little obvious after a while. And you might go back and build a new deck when that happens, but you are sort of just changing out the coat of paint, on essentially what your game plan is, because it still is one of abundant resources by necessity, because the system itself is creating that environment. Really, like, constrained resource gameplay doesn't really go very well in Commander because you're trying to do it to 4 players at once. There's like a Tiny Bones deck that I think attempts to do this, but another force being applied here is that casual players, again, tend to not like this style of gameplay, and we end up in kind of the forbidden category because Commander players, I think, look at this as a hindrance to their experiences and resulting in a game that's just not all that particularly fun to them. So to kind of wrap up here, I think the question then sort of becomes, do games need both of these things, right? If you are choosing to remove constrained resources from your game, you are telling one particular type of story. If your game is only about constrained resources, you are only telling one other type of story. And maybe the goal is to be able to tell many different types of stories with your game. I think the biggest risk without including constrained resources is that you are removing a source of friction, where if you're removing the ability for players to constrain another player's resources, you are not incentivizing the discovering creative and unintuitive ways to use cards to get out of that particular situation. From kind of a ludonarrative perspective, one thing that's interesting about constrained resources is it does create a villain, right? It creates a dynamic at play that makes people go, ooh, like that's really striking a nerve because it is constraining me. It's moving me towards that frustration part of things. And I want to team up with other players to like remove that frustration barrier and unlock the rest of our abundance, right? I think it's a very interesting and dynamic way to kind of create heroes and villains at the table. I think by removing this style of play almost in its entirety, you're missing out on a whole half of what makes the game Magic compelling. The biggest risk, especially in Magic's systems, is that if you're both playing a parallel style game with abundant resources, the game might play out very similarly each time, but at least you played a game, right? And if constrained resource strategies, especially in Magic, are too powerful, then you may not have played a game at all. And I think that is the sort of biggest risk here and why these strategies have become sidelined in Magic the Gathering. And I also think that this is part of the key to the feeling of old school Magic. And the idea of creating a new system that constrains resources and is about fighting through that fighting through what your opponent is doing so that you can come out the other side in a situation of abundant resources, if that's what your deck is attempting to do, and really get that gameplay of, okay, well, sometimes it's a abundant versus constrained resource game. Sometimes it's abundant versus abundant, and other times it's constrained versus constrained. And those almost most zoomed out view of the game, I think is part of what makes it so compelling. And of course, it's also maybe worth touching briefly on the fact that this teaches different types of skills, right? It teaches, if we look back at our boredom versus frustration our ability to sort of fight through that frustration to that learning, right? And reframing the challenge that's in front of us as one of perseverance. Part of this is just a preference, right? Part of this is what different people are looking for in different situations, whether that's, sort of the novelty parallel play side of the Animal Crossing side of things, or the frustrating, challenging, perseverant, skill testing aspects of Elden Ring. I think the next video will probably dive deeper into this idea of what makes something compelling. So make sure that you subscribe so that you're notified when that video goes up on Thursday. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.